Welcome back, everybody, to Prophetic Discipleship. This is Pastor Greg. I'm delighted to have you guys all here. Today, I'm going to be going into an analysis of Big Nick's video concerning biblical end times, whether or not these rivers turning red is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And so, if you are interested in delving into that, I encourage you to stay tuned and give this a like, subscribe. Let me know if you have any refutations of my video, any rebuttals or challenges or critiques. Please do so respectfully. I invite it. I don't shy away from challenges, but do so cordially, respectfully, and let's try to avoid insults and ad hominems. Let's stay to the text. Okay. And so, without further ado, let's go right into his video, shall we?
Further ado, let's get into it. Rivers all around the world are suddenly turning blood red, leading many to believe that the biblical end times are underway. Recently, a river in Sydney, Australia turned...
Let me stop right there. One of the things that we have to understand, first of all, is that when the Bible talks about the end times, we have to ask ourselves, or the last days, we have to ask, what is the last days of? What is it? What's when the Bible talks about the end? The end of what? What is in view when the biblical authors speak about the end? Is it the end of time? And we'd be surprised to learn that it doesn't talk about the end of time. It talks about the Bible doesn't talk about the end of time. It talks about the time of the end. The end of what? The end of the Mosaic age. The end of the Levitical priesthood. The end of the first Jerusalem being the place of which God dwells and has his and the Jewish people have covenantal standing with God. That first covenant, the sacrifices, the altars, the temple, all that was passing away. And what we learn in Matthew 24, verse 3, it doesn't talk about the end of the world. If you look at the Greek word, it's aeon, ionos, right? Ionos or ion, and it simply means age. And Jesus also speaks about the end of the age in Matthew 24, verse 14. And the end of the age is drawing from Daniel. And we know that he's drawing from Daniel from verse 15 of Matthew 24. And in Daniel chapter 12, he also talks about the end of the age. In the Hebrew, it's the word olam. And the Jews had anticipated a future olam, a future age, once their present age had ceased. And the age they were living in was the age of Torah, the age of Moses. And they were anticipating the age of Messiah, right? And so we have to keep that in view when we're listening to when we hear the term age or end times or last days.
Completely red, leaving the locals baffled, yet no cause was confirmed. This was at the Sydney Harbor, and it took place about 2 months ago, on December 4th, 2024. Then, a river in Lima, Peru turned absolutely red with no explanation. This was even more recent, being reported on February 6, 2025. And finally, a river in Buenos Aires, Argentina just turned blood red as well. This river turning red was just reported a day after the one in Peru that we previously saw. Considering these events all happened back to back, it's been making headlines, causing many people to believe that the biblical apocalypse could be underway. The Bible says in the last days that God's wrath will be poured out on the earth.
Okay, so let's stop there. Another thing that he mentioned is that, excuse me one second here. Yeah, one of the things that he mentioned is that he's talking about Argentina. He's talking about Sydney, Australia. He's talking about Peru. Now, one of the fundamental things that we have to understand when we're reading the Bible is that it was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. It was written to that first century audience. It was written to those that dwelt in Jerusalem. Now, of course, depending if we're talking about Corinthians, right, it was written to the Corinthian church, or Philippians, it was written to the church at Philippi. But when we're talking about the book of Revelation, and we're talking about the Olivet Discourse, the prophecies their mention concerns the judgment that was soon going to come upon Jerusalem. Now, Argentina, Sydney, Australia, and Peru has had absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with the focus of the New Testament authors. And so when we speak about rivers turning into blood, we have to understand that the New Testament authors were completely estranged and foreign to any other rivers having turned into blood or turned to red, other than the one that is in view in Revelation chapter 16. And the one in Revelation chapter 16, as we will see shortly, is Mystery Babylon. And Mystery Babylon is not concerning the whole globe. It's not considering considering the whole world. It's considering, which I believe, Mystery Babylon was Jerusalem. And I'll justify that point here shortly. But my point now is that why are we grabbing Argentina? Why are we grabbing Sydney, Australia? Why are we grabbing all these various other places and applying mail that was given to a particular place at a particular time for a particular people to somebody else? It makes no sense. Similar to me trying to, me taking the mail that's in your post, your post office or your mailbox and saying that it applies to me. I can glean from it and benefit from it, but nevertheless, it's not given to me. Let's continue forward.
The key indicator being that bodies of water will turn red. Revelation 16:3-4 says, "The second angel poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became like the blood of a corpse, and every living thing died that was in the sea. The third angel poured out his bowl into the rivers and the springs of water, and they became blood." Regardless if this is a prophetic biblical fulfillment or just a precursor to the end times, what's certain is that Jesus Christ is coming back to judge the living and the dead. Just as
hold on.
The end times prophecy has stated, strange events in nature.
So notice how he kind of backsteps. He kind of plays it safe and say, even if this isn't, however, blah, 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 blah. It's a precursor, or one thing we do know for certain is that Jesus is coming back. Now, this video isn't about the second coming of the Lord. I have other videos that I might put in the description below, or I'll put on a tag here somewhere. But to further justify this point, because this video is not concerning that particular topic, but the Lord had already come in 70 AD. I know this comes as a shock and a surprise for many people. No, I don't think he's walking around on the earth somewhere. That's not what the coming of the Lord was concerning. But let me just give you a couple of passages in passing, just so you can go to, if you don't have time to watch that other video, Matthew chapter 10, verse 23. Matthew chapter 16, verse 26 through 27. Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. Verse 30 and 34. And Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 32. All concern the coming of the Lord that was to take place before the passing of that generation, before some of those that were standing there would taste death. And those standing there were the apostles. But nonetheless, go check out that video. But let's take a look here in Revelation chapter 16. I want to prove this point. We'll get back to our friend Big Nick over here shortly. Excuse me, I'm still working out this thing, man. So you have to forgive me because I don't know how to fully operate and function this thing efficiently at this point. But nonetheless, Revelation chapter 16, and he says, "Then the third angel poured out his bowl into the rivers and the springs of waters, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the water saying, Righteous are you, the one who is and who was, the only Holy One, because you judged these things. For they poured out the blood of the saints and the prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. They deserve it." And the verse 3, I forgot to read verse 3. "The second angel poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became blood like that of a dead man, and every living thing in the sea died." So notice though, the rivers turning into blood here, right, are being poured out upon a particular people. They're being poured out on those who, according to verse 6 of Revelation 16, did what? They poured out the blood of the saints and the prophets. Okay, so now let me continue to move forward and read in Revelation chapter 17, because the bowls that are being poured out, excuse me, in Revelation chapter 16 continue on over into Revelation chapter 17. And Revelation chapter 17 is concerning Mystery Babylon. And Mystery Babylon is being judged also for her sexual immorality. And if you look at the language there, it's speaking about infidelity, whoredom, betraying one's husband. And Jerusalem was an unfaithful wife. It's careful language there in the Greek that refers to an unfaithful wife. And that's precisely what Jerusalem was. For all of her iniquity, for all of her idolatry, for crucifying the Son of God, they betrayed the Lord. And then it says, Babylon, verse 5, and on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes, and of the abominations of the earth. The abomination is also a very specific word that's used in Torah, typically to refer to those that, yes, committed sexual immorality, such as homosexuality, but also to sacrifice pigs was an abomination, right? And to desecrate the covenant in many respects was considered an abomination. And so these transgressions that are in view are covenantal transgressions. And in verse 6, and it says, and I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly. And then you can also go to Revelation chapter 18. The individual in view, the entity that's in view, is still Babylon the Great, Mystery Babylon. And in verse 20 of Revelation chapter 18 says, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. So the judgment or the wrath of God that Big Nick is talking about here, that he says will be poured out in the last days, was already poured out in the last days. And it was the last days of Israel. It was the last days of Jerusalem before her judgment in AD 70, from AD 66 to AD 70, when she was judged during the Jewish wars. And her the climax of her utter destruction came when her temple was decimated. And to fulfill the promise that Jesus gave in Matthew 24, verse 1 through 3, and he says, surely I say to you that there is not one stone here that will not be thrown down, not one stone left, on another that will not be tossed down, that will not be thrown down, will not be decimated. And so the interesting thing is, and then you can also look at Revelation chapter 18, verse 24. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints and of all who have been slaughtered on the earth. Now, if you turn to Matthew chapter 23, Matthew chapter 23, what you take note of is Matthew chapter 23 sets the framework, it's the backdrop for the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, which is an entire chapter containing the prophecies that Jesus said would be fulfilled in the last days. And when you read in Matthew chapter 23, he begins rebuking and chiding the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the law. He says, woe unto you, Pharisees. He pronounces many woes. And then in verse 32, look at what he says. Oh, verse 31. No, excuse me, verse 30. And you say, if you had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves. Where is this? You testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. So remember in Revelation chapter 16, chapter 17, chapter 18, the fall of Mystery Babylon, right? And in Mystery Babylon, the rivers turned into blood. Mystery Babylon was guilty of marital infidelity, and marriage speaks of covenant. This is Jerusalem being unfaithful to the Lord in that first covenant, right? And she was guilty of abominations. That speaks of covenantal, iniquitous transgression, slaughtering of pigs and homosexuality and other things, right? Idolatry. Ezekiel, he's seen many abominations. What were they doing? They were worshiping demons. They were worshiping foreign gods. They're worshiping idols. And so the term abomination is used, is attributed to Babylon. And so the pagans were not given the covenant, right? I'm not saying that pagans were holy or they were righteous or, upright. They were certainly wicked, but they were never in covenant with the Lord. But thirdly, they're also charged with the blood guilt of the martyrs, of the prophets, of the apostles. And look at what Jesus says. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You snakes, you offspring of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you will fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stoned those who have been sent to her. How I've wanted to gather your children together the way the hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing, but you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. So 3 points. Their house that was going to be left to desolate is pointing back to Daniel chapter 12 and Daniel chapter 9 that speaks about the Great Tribulation, Israel's tribulation, Jerusalem's tribulation, and the desolation of her house, which occurred in AD 70. And so you can see here, that's point number one. Point number two, the judgment is localized, not universalized. Why do I say that? Because Jerusalem was guilty of the bloodshed of Zechariah between the temple and the altar. Was America guilty of that? Was Argentina or Sydney, Australia, or Peru guilty of that? No. And so the bloodshed of the martyrs in Matthew 23 is the bloodshed of the martyrs in Revelation 16, Revelation 17, Revelation 18. Excuse me. And then that means if the bloodshed of the prophets and apostles and the martyrs of Matthew 23 is the same of Revelation 16 and Revelation 17 and Revelation 18, then in Revelation 16, the blood is poured out into the rivers as a judgment of theirs for them pouring out the blood of the martyrs. So if Jerusalem was guilty of the bloodshed of the martyrs, what is that telling us? By what do we deduce from that? That it would be Jerusalem's rivers that would be turned into blood, right? So number one, the judgment concerns the desolation of the house, which was the temple that Jesus speaks about, would be thrown down in Matthew 24, right? And that would be the climactic judgment that all these birth pains need to be poured out leading up to it. Number two, it's not universalized, it's localized because Jerusalem was guilty of the bloodshed of Zechariah. And number three, Jesus indicates a time constraint, that it would be fulfilled before the passing of that generation. So we see that it's concerning the temple, that relates the judgment to the Jews. Number two, it would be for the bloodshed of Abel to Zechariah, right? As well as the apostles whom the Lord has sent to them, which would also include the Jews. And number three is there's a time factor that constrains the fulfillment of that before the passing of that generation, which according to Psalm 95, verse 10, is 40 years. Hence why the Lord says, 40 years was I angry with that generation. Right? 40 years they passed through the wilderness. He was angry with that generation. But in addition to that, I want us to turn to Luke chapter 13, verse 33, just to give one more indicator. Luke chapter 13, verse 33. And the word of the Lord reads, "Nevertheless, I must go on my journey today and tomorrow and the next day, for it cannot be that a prophet would perish outside of Jerusalem." Now, of course, Jesus is being hyperbolic here. But the point is that Jerusalem was guilty in large part of all the shedding of the blood of the prophets. So the shedding of the blood of the prophets in Revelation chapter 16 is the same shedding of the blood of the prophets in Matthew 23. But if the same are equivalent, are identical, then that means that the rivers turning into blood red was the rivers of Jerusalem, not Argentina or Sydney, Australia, or Peru. And then verse 34, if there was any doubt of whom he was speaking, it says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who have been sent to her, how I often wanted to gather your children together, just as a hen gathers her young under her wings, and you were not willing. Behold, your house is left to you desolate." Same desolation of Daniel chapter 12. So now I want to read for us. Let's return back to our friend here, Big Nick. Let's see here. Okay, we'll be listening to him shortly. But here's a passage that I wanted to read from Josephus. And if you ever have a chance to get a copy of this book, it will serve you well. Now, Josephus was a Jewish historian that lived in the time of the first century. He mentions Jesus in the Antiquities of the Jews. He mentions John the Baptist. He mentioned that Jesus was a miracle worker. Okay. And so he mentions many things. He mentions the desolation of the temple. He mentions the abomination that causes desolation, which Eusebius, the ancient church historian, also mentions. But remember, this is Josephus is contemporaneous to the time of some of the apostles. So he lived in the first century. Now, this is what he said in the Antiquities of the Jews, book 3, chapter 9. "Now, a few days after this, the river Jordan was seen to be turned into blood." Right? "And a great many other prodigies were seen, which so terrified the people that they could not but think that God was angry with them." You see that? He's saying that the river Jordan was turned into blood. Okay? Now, thinking to the first century audience, what would they have inferred from the book of Revelation? That he was talking about, that the Lord's talking about Argentina? The Lord's talking about Sydney, Australia? He was talking about Peru? No, the first century audience would have applied what was written to them as being for them. Right now, notice, in the Antiquities of the Jews, written by the same author, book 6 of chapter 9, section 4, it says, "And now the river of the city," that is Jerusalem, "was filled with the bodies of the slain, and the waters ran with blood. They made a great slaughter of the people, and the blood of the slain was so great that it caused the river to swell and overflow as though it were turned into blood." When you go to Luke chapter 21, and I hope this is okay. I know some of you guys got a memory like a goldfish and y'all can't endure sound doctrine to save your life. but I'm here to proclaim the sacred scriptures. So he that hath an ear, let him hear. Right? That's an allusion to what was said in the book of Revelation. He had ears, let him hear what the Spirit says unto the churches. Look what Jesus says in Matthew 21, which is just is the parallel to Matthew 24. It's Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse in Mark 13 and Matthew 24. Verse 20 of Luke 21, but when you see, it's talking about the apostles, when you, not us, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by our armies, which took place in AD 66, then recognize that her desolation is near. The same desolation of Matthew 23, same desolation of Luke 13, verse 33 and 34. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So if this is a universal application, why is the application only given to those who are in Judea? Would he include those in Argentina, those in Sydney, Australia, those in Peru, those in America? Right? No. He says, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Those who are inside the city must leave. And those who are in the city, in the country, must not enter the city. Because, so that did occur. The church was not overtaken by that wrath. And they, by an oracle, were led from the city, from Judea, to a city called Pella. And they were rescued. All those, according to Daniel chapter 12, whose names were written in the book of life, which was the remnant of Jerusalem, were saved. But those whose names were not recorded were damned by the judgment of the Lord. It says, and because these are the days of punishment, which took place in the first century, these are the days of punishment, so that all things, which includes Revelation, which have been written will be fulfilled. Woe to those women who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress, for the Greek word thlipsis, tribulation, and wrath to this people, not all people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword, and will be led captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. You know what's fascinating? The times of the Gentiles are mentioned in Revelation chapter 11. Verse 1 and following. And Jerusalem is given unto the Gentiles, guess how long? 42 months or 3.5 years. You know how people talk about there's 3.5 years of tribulation? 3.5 years of tribulation to apostate Jerusalem for her iniquity, for her sin, for shedding the blood of the martyrs. And in Daniel chapter 12, guess how long that tribulation lasts? From the moment the abomination of desolation is set up in the holy place, 3.5 years, 42 months. And guess what? According to rabbinic literature, according to Jewish literature, according to Josephus, according to history, the Jewish history, you know how long the wars lasted? That's right, 42 months. 42 months, 3.5 years of tribulation, because they afflicted the church. Now God meted out judgment upon them and began afflicting them. So, let's return to our friend here, Big Nick.
Have been occurring all around the world, just like Jesus said it would in Matthew 24:8, signaling the fulfillment of birth pains that must occur on the earth. We are witnessing not just a physical phenomena, but a spiritual moment. The Bible has always used signs in nature to communicate powerful messages. What we're currently seeing with rivers turning red globally serves as a reminder of God's authority over creation. When God brought the plagues upon Egypt, the Nile River turned to blood as a sign of his power and as a warning. It was a stark demonstration that God is sovereign over every part of creation. Today, as we see similar events unfold in different regions around the world, it should remind us that God still reigns over the earth. His judgments are not always immediate and obvious, but they are certain and they serve a purpose. When we see these events, it's important to know that God's judgments are never arbitrary. They are always tied to his justice and mercy. These blood-red rivers may not be the final fulfillment of biblical prophecy, but they serve as vivid symbols to remind us of the state of the world. A world that has turned away from God, embraces sin, and ignores the cries for repentance. The book of Revelation speaks about God's wrath, but it is not his desire to destroy. Rather, it's his desire to call people back to himself. The presence of these red rivers, seemingly back to back, seems like a call to attention, a nudge.
Now, let me say this too, also about the rivers. You can just do a quick investigation, and those who know about sedimentaries and rocks and soils and stuff like that. That this isn't an uncommon phenomena. This has happened quite a number of times. And there's reasons, urban runoff and erosions, that in the soils that end up causing this tintish type of this brownish type of tint in the waters, right? And so there are explanations. I don't know if we're just incompetent in our investigation, or we just conveniently don't do the research because we have a bit of confirmation bias, and this appears to be a very juicy story for us to capture in order to fearmonger and then inadvertently get likes, follows, and subscribes that then increases our bank account. So, but this is the last thing I'll say. In Matthew 24, the birth pains, the motif of travail is actually very common. You can read this in Isaiah. You can read this in the prophets, that Israel is said to have gone in travail, and that as she travailed, she sought to bring deliverance for the world, but she couldn't bring it forth. And so this notion of this idea of travail corresponds with pains, tribulation pains. And so the first century was going through those tribulation pains. The church was going through the tribulation pains, wars, rumors of wars, and earthquakes and famines. And if you're interested, I'll put a link in the description below or right here in the tag of where I do a verse by verse exegesis of Matthew 24, verse 1 through 34. And I show how all those birth pangs were all fulfilled in the first century by citing historical evidence and exegeting the text and corroborating with other passages within the Holy Writ. But the birth pains was something that was taking place in the first century. And so let's not read ourselves into the Bible. And so this is what I was saying in closing. I want us to become better discerners of the sacred scriptures. Because what happens is when we, listen to guys like this that just, whether intentionally or unintentionally, fearmonger, constantly clicking on the news just to find some juicy thing. I mean, you can go on his channel and you see how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people watch this type of garbage. And it's poor exegesis. It's poor. It's eisegesis. It's not accurately interpreting the text, and we're just taking our juicy picks of what's broadcasted today on the news and social media and say that will garner views, that will garner attention, this will collect likes, and this will increase my pay, because people with followings like this are monetized, and they get a pretty penny. And I know personally, without saying names, that people like this get a lot of money. And don't ask me how I know, but I know. The point is that if we start exegeting the text, our views start sinking. And we need to really be careful and cautious about people, because when you follow the money, you follow who's controlling what, right? And so more often than not, when money's involved, there's Ravi Zacharias, I remember he quoted Winston Churchill. He said, "Truth is so valuable, it's more valuable than the atomic bomb. Is it so valuable that it's often guarded by a bodyguard of lies? Wisdom and truth is more precious than jewels. And so all that thou canst desire is not to be compared unto her." And so let's place a high premium on truth, not things that tickle our ears, not things that seem to make a good Christian news anchor or Christian novellas and Christian gossip and drama. People aren't interested in the truth of the text. And yet today I've done just that. I've exegeted the text, and we'll be coming to a close. Actually, we're not going to get through this whole video. You can on your own. I think I've kind of covered the gist of what needed to be said. And so with that said, I hope that I gave a brief synopsis of why this here is false and why the scriptures are presenting us an entirely different message that was already fulfilled in the first century. And so God bless you guys. In Jesus' name, amen.